Okay, everybody. Call to order. Call to order, everybody. It's time to start. So welcome, everybody. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the co-organizers of this seminar in its present incarnation, along with Zach Lesser, who is the Edward Kane Professor of English here at Penn, who is unfortunately not able to be here this evening. John Pollock, the Curator of Research Services at the Kislak Center, along with Eileen Malcolm, who's our Bristol-Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, and the person who really makes everything work. So welcome all. A few housekeeping matters. There are still places at the table, so I strongly encourage those of you who are holding back to move forward. There will be a sign-up sheet circulating around the room, so please do sign that. If you're not on the listserv and would like to be, just please do add your email address, and Eileen will make sure that you get the weekly announcements. For those of you who are joining us remotely, we welcome you, and we ask you, second nature by now, please mute yourselves during the talk, but make yourselves known and present during the Q&A, either by posing your questions in the chat, and Eileen will be curating those, or maybe even better, raise your hand and we will beam you up and let you participate in your own voices. It is really a huge pleasure to introduce Peter Stallybrass this evening. I'll say that Peter needs no introduction. I say that not only because I'm punting, because Zach was supposed to give the introduction, and he can't, and I haven't prepared much of anything, but he also needs no introduction to anybody who's here. Anybody who's a regular participant in this seminar knows that we invoke him all of the time as our founding director. He's not only the founder of this seminar, of course, but this seminar has occupied many of us, like every Monday evening at 5:15 during the semester for close to 30 years now, which is just extraordinary. We'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary in January, I believe. So it is absolutely amazing. This workshop has spawned many imitators at other universities, none of them as glorious as ours. This is not a value judgment so much, but I will say that none of them meet as regularly as this one. So that we do this on a weekly basis, again, is testimony to the energy that Peter put into motion, the group that he assembled here. And really, I think it's safe to say that without Peter Stallybrass, Penn would not be the center in the study of the history of the book and material texts that it is recognized to be. And so the debt we owe to Peter is huge. It has been one of my great pleasures and privileges to work with Peter over the years. There are certain wedges between us that will never probably be joined. He and I will always have a very different sense of the merits of the film Love Actually. And we will always have a very different sense of the merits of answering one's email promptly. And you can identify for yourselves like which side of these debates each of us stand on. But honestly, Peter is just one of the most generous collaborative scholars that I have ever known, and probably that many of you have ever known. He is, of course, a collaborator in print with the late Alan White, with Anne Rosalind Jones, with Zach, with Jim Green, with John Pollock, with any number of people, and he's a collaborator with huge generosity. I had the pleasure of collaborating with Peter for many years on the material text book series at the University of Pennsylvania Press. we thank you for being who you are. We also thank you for being the brilliant presence that you are. And so I will stop blathering more and what's that like? Peter start. No, I will let Peter present his talk.
Well, thanks very much. It was a wonderful introduction, and I'm just very delighted to be back. So it's called the Erasable Ten Commandments, the Decalogue as wax tablets, although I go off in a rather different direction. So I might have even changed the title and so on, as people do. So there's more modern stuff because I've got those. It was originally just going to be the Middle Ages, and now it's going forward into the 17th century for reasons you'll see why. The Ten Commandments are meant to be remembered, even if they need to be copied on stone a second time after Moses has smashed the first two tablets. Why then is the Decalogue usually depicted from the 11th to the 14th centuries, not as written on stone, but as inscribed on erasable wax tablets? Perhaps this has been so often overlooked because we tend to think of writing as typically black, or at least dark, on a support that is white, or at least whitish, whether that support be paper or parchment. But the wax of writing tablets from Classical Antiquity to the late Middle Ages was always dyed a dark color. So what's going wrong here? Why is that not going forward? There we go. Okay. So so the wax of writing tablets from Classical Antiquity to the late Middle Ages was always dyed a dark color, usually black or green. The writing in the form of inscriptions in the wax with a stylus appeared as white against a dark background. Writing was done with the stylus, one end of which was pointed and the other end of which was flattened and was used for corrections and simply so as to create a tabula rasa, as we still say, so as to reuse the surface for new writing. Hence the common Latin phrase vertere stylus, which meaning simply to reverse the stylus, or even by metaphorical extension, to change one's mind. So it's so widely used. You know, you have a thought, you write with one thing, and you turn your stylus and then erase it with the other end. You see that more clearly with this depiction here. I don't know if you can see the bottom. She's got the pointed bit to her lips, but down here is a flattened end. So that's what you mean. You use one end to write with and the other to erase with. So that's what vertere stylus means. Stylum means. One uses the same implement to write and to erase. Usually, because they were erasable, wax tablets were thought of as a medium for temporary records. We can actually debate that because there are counterexamples and whether they are used for permanent records, but that's another question, which I won't address today. So usually they were erasable and they were used thought of as a medium for temporary records, which if they were to be preserved, needed to be transcribed onto another surface. This is what we see at the beginning of the Rupertsberg Civias, where Hildegard of Bingen writes on wax tablets with a stylus, while her secretary, Volmar, appears to her left, to our right, with a gathering of parchment under his arm. Today, we can read Hildegard's work because they were preserved on the parchment of the Rupertsberg manuscript, long after the erasable writing on the wax tablets had disappeared. Similarly, St. Gregory, inspired like Hildegard by the Holy Spirit, transcribes the divine message onto a wax diptych that he holds in his left hand, while with his right, he holds a stylus with a point on one end and a flattened head at the other. To his left, our right, his secretary and scribe Peter the deacon, has the necessary writing equipment to transcribe Gregory's revelations onto the more permanent medium of parchment. From a linguistic perspective, the Latin tabula, plural tabulae, like the English tables or the French table, was a radically polysemous word. At its simplest, tabulae can mean wooden boards or planks. The tabernacle, for instance, has six tabulae, meaning 6 planks on the west side, and the tabulae are made of setting wood. So it's nothing to do with 10 Commandments and such, it just means wood in this setting. But tabula can also mean a slate, a slab of marble or of stone, and as well as a writing surface, it can also refer to what is written on any of these surfaces, a memorandum, a list, but also an indictment or legal code, like the 12 tables or tabulae of the Republic. In other words, the word tabulae can conjure up for an artist a wide range of possibilities. The duae tabulae of Exodus and Deuteronomy seem to have suggested for most artists the diptychs that were the most common form of wax tablets that were used throughout the Middle Ages. So this is an example of exactly what Moses is doing. This is, however, extraordinary, since the depictions systematically contradict the biblical text, where it is repeatedly emphasized that the 10 Commandments are inscribed on stone. The only textual clue that I know of that could provide at least a partial explanation is found in an 11th century translation of the Bible into Old English. In her groundbreaking article on the round-top tablets of the law, Ruth Mellenkoff notes that Augustine used tabulae and diptycha interchangeably to refer to the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were written. She adds that, quote, his word usage reflected his own environment, where wax-covered writing tablets were often hinged together. 2 were called diptycha, 3 triptycha, etc., until many a codex. So the origin of the word codex, meaning actually, will come to mean a book, is actually wax tablets that are held together. She adds, Ruth Mellenkoff adds that his word usage, oh, sorry, I misread that. Thus, a diptych was the equivalent of 2 writing tablets. Mellenkoff goes on to emphasize the particular importance of 11th century England in the development of the iconography of the round-topped tablets of the law, and draws attention to the Old English hexateuch. But the first time that they are mentioned is at Exodus chapter 31, verse 18, where God "Seilde Moise, Torsteinene Wexbreder." Oh, sorry, one passed there. So this is the same passage 3 times, so it's just magnified at different levels. So the actual, what it's saying here is that what it means is that God gave Moses 2 stone wax tablets. So that's obviously contradicting. This is wax here, wax breder. So the wax tablets. So the profound contradiction is captured by the 2 Old English words, steinene and wex, stone and wax. But whatever the significance of the Old English hexateuch in the development of the iconography of a diptych of writing tables with round tops, I cannot believe that it had much to do with depictions of Moses receiving or even writing the 10 Commandments on wax. To begin with, the translator of the Old English hexateuch only uses the word wexbreder a single time. Otherwise, tabulae was systematically translated as tabulan. Nor do the illustrations of the cotton manuscript suggest wax tablets, at least they don't to me. They could be wax tablets, but there's no reason in my view they're separate. and I don't see these as wax tablets anyway. They appear as two separate tablets, not as a diptych, and they are golden. When the Ten Commandments were elsewhere depicted as wax tablets, they could be one of any of the colors that the wax was dyed, most commonly black or green, but never, to my knowledge, yellow or gold. Here are some of the examples of the colors that the wax of writing tables was dyed. So I'm just going to go through the colors, so you just get a sense of. Let me see if I can turn off this thing that's interrupting the screen. Does that go? That's better. There we go. Okay, I need to go. So these are green dyed. So the rim, these are the rims round the tablets that you pour the wax onto. That's why they always are depicting these rims around that holds the wax in place until it hardens. These are red dyed wax diptychs. I don't know. Is there Eileen, is there a way to get rid of the bar at the bottom or not? But not really. Okay. I won't do anything foolish. I know that these. Oh, let's move. Oh no, it's just going. Maybe better at the top. I'll try it at the top anyway. We'll see. No, it goes. Okay. Okay. What have I done? I've done something wrong. I think. Okay, I have to go back. Okay. There we go. That's okay. Okay, so these are red and green dyed wax diptychs. They're different colors. So why did the painters throughout the High Middle Ages depict the Ten Commandments as being written on wax rather than on stone? I do not believe that we can find any textual answer for this. In my view, the central problem begins with the very concept of illustration. In his great work on religious art in France, first published in 1908, Émile Malle wrote, "There is not a single artistic work produced in the 15th century," but he also extends it outwards, forwards and backwards. He says, "There is not a single artistic work produced in the 15th century that cannot be explained by a book. The artists," he carries on, "the artists invented nothing, they translated into their own language the ideas of others." This seems to me profoundly wrong. I do not mean to suggest for a moment that illuminations were the unaided work of painters. Patrons, scribes, booksellers, and others were all involved in the creation of luxury manuscripts. But even where the illustration of a text was a possibility, which I think it often isn't, but that's another question, it is striking how often medieval illuminators developed counter-narratives to the biblical text. I don't know why it does that. Okay. One such counter-narrative that I've written about elsewhere is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. So many of you already know this. In the dominant iconographies of so-called illustrations of the scene, Adam and Eve appear as either naked or with their genitals covered with a fig leaf, or sometimes fig leaves, plural. So common are these two depictions that most people today imagine that Genesis must contain one or the other of these accounts. So, of course, as we all know, Eden is Manhattan, and to be cast out over Washington Bridge is a fate worse than death, so you will actually die. But what Adam and Eve are wearing here, or they each have a single fig leaf. So no, it's so common is this image that you can expect to find it in all sorts of places, adverse, God knows where. The New Yorker follows the fig leaf tradition that was established by medieval illuminators, who were in turn followed by artists in printed Bibles. In the woodcut that interrupts the text in the 1539 Great Bible, Adam and Eve, in fact, are naked, following an alternative medieval iconography. In fact, both illustrations directly contradict the biblical text, which tells us that Adam and Eve are expelled only after God has reclothed them in leathern garments. So this is actually where the text appears. So you can read up there, and the Lord God said, behold, yonder man, I'm starting too late. Unto this, higher up, unto the same Adam also, and to his wife, did the Lord God make leathern garments and clothe them. And here it is, and then it's only at the bottom, he cast them forth from Eden. So, both of these images, the New Yorker and this one, directly contradict the text. So why then did painters throughout the High Middle Ages depict the Ten Commandments as being written on wax rather than stone? Oh, I think I've already said that. Okay. The dominant images of the expulsion effectively rewrite the biblical text. They are the more fascinating and important precisely because they produce meanings for which there is no textual support, as I think is normally true with films made from books. I think there's nothing more boring than the kind of literary class which you see a film only because it follows the book so closely, which seems to be a very dull thing to do. My argument against illustration is not the same thing as giving preference to image over word, an opposition that rarely makes sense in medieval manuscripts. In the case of the 7 luxury manuscripts of La Somme le Roi, a survey for the king, produced in the orbit of Philip IV of France, all 7 were illuminated with the same specific instructions by an advisor for each of the 15 full-page miniatures. So these are the instructions. I'm not going to go through them. I'm just going to talk about 3 of the. I'm not going to come back. This is the notion of Moses has a horned head, and unfortunately, it takes me too far away. I've got a huge section on that of what it means for him to have a horned head, as he's usually depicted. But I'm not going to touch. I'm going to talk about the 2 other highlighted moments. So, as I suggested before, both the Latin and the French table, the French table of the vernacular manuscripts, do not commit a reader to imagine anything very specific about the material support on which the 10 Commandments were written. You do not have to picture, when you read the text, any specific size or shape for the tables, or to decide whether they are joined like a diptych or are made on 2 separate tablets, or to choose between them being strictly rectangular, it's another whole debate I won't get into, or having rounded tops. But a painter does have to make exactly such choices. But there is one choice that one would have expected every painter to make, not only because of the biblical text, but also, as you can see, at least for the 7 first manuscripts, an advisor drew up explicit instructions of what each of the miniatures should depict. And the instruction for the first miniature of the painters to depict God, giving deux tables de pierre à Moïse. Yet not one of the artists who received these instructions followed them. They followed instead the well-established artistic convention of depicting the Decalogue in the form of a wax diptych, or in the single case of a 1311 Amiens manuscript, a wax triptych. So here I've lined them up. The wax triptych is here, 1, 2, 3. All of the other ones are wax diptychs. So why did painters deliberately construct a counter-narrative of the most extreme kind in imagining tablets of erasable wax rather than of unerasable stone? Of course, one of the ironies of the stone tablets is that far from being a permanent record, they are immediately smashed by Moses and have to be recreated all over again. Nonetheless, the second set of tablets are imagined, as we now say metaphorically, written in stone. to be written in wax means what? I do not have any single answer to this question. Certainly, as with the naked or fig-leaved Adam and Eve at the expulsion, once the iconographic traditions were established, artists followed each other rather than any textual description. But how and why did the iconographic tradition of wax tablets get established in the first place? One possible reason is that wax tablets were identified both with inspiration and with autographic writing. Wax tablets, in the image of St. Hildegard in the Rupertsberg manuscript, which I showed at the beginning, Hildegard is depicted at the moment of inspiration, the flames of the Holy Spirit reaching down and embracing her head. Wax tablets were, since classical antiquity, the most rapid and immediate way of taking notes. Consumed in the moment, Hildegard does not have time for the technologies of desk, ruled parchment, pen, and ink. This was delegated to her scribe, Volmar, when he copies out her visions later from her notes and from her dictation. Cicero had flattered his close friends by sending them wax tablets written in his own hand, rather than letters in ink on papyrus, copied out by a scribe. The scribal copies were absolutely necessary, as the presence of Volmar emphasizes, but the authenticity of the text is guaranteed by the authorial hand, not authorial in the modern sense at all, but because it's a hand that is in turn guided by God. In other words, a writer, the evangelists, for instance, are always scribes. They cannot be imagined as the originators of the text, because that would be actually to take away from God breathes into them. That's the original meaning for inspiration. So God breathes into them. So Moses himself, a copyist of the second set of commandments, after breaking the first, authenticates God's words, taking them down himself on a wax tablet with a stylus. From this perspective, there is also something comic about the 15th century Moseses who begin to be depicted with stone tablets in the same period that wax tablets were being displaced by erasable notebooks made with coated parchment on paper. In the Paduan picture Bible, Moses sits on a rock, a hammer in his right hand, a chisel in his left, as Joshua looks on. But when he is finished, so there's one of the tablets, they're separate, there's one tablet already finished. So this isn't writing, he's actually just preparing the stones. So he's getting the stones ready, because God's told him, that is in the Bible, God's actually told him that, I think God's pissed off by this point, because he's already made one set of turn state. He doesn't want to keep using his finger to do magical tricks. But when he has finished his laborious preparatory task and is faithfully writing at God's dictation, he is clearly done with time-consuming chiseling. Bizarrely, he writes with a pen and ink on the stone tablets. To what extent did earlier painters, who were themselves craftsmen, reconceive the long and laborious process of making stone tablets and carving the commandments letter by letter? So you have to imagine Moses coming up the hill with his sort of huge rucksack on his back, which has all this equipment. He's gonna have to make these commandments, and it's going to take a long time to carve letter by letter. To what extent did earlier painters, who were themselves craftsmen, reconceive the long and laborious process of making stone tablets and carving the commandments letter by letter in the more practical terms of a writing technology that was suited not only to their own sketches, and these people sketched on wax tablets as well as wrote, but also for writing in the market, or for that matter, on Mount Sinai, without chisel, and even without the difficulties of pen and ink. But I also believe that there was indeed one biblical source for the wax tablets, not in the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, but in the prophecies. In the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 11, God promises, and I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within their bowels, and I will take their stony heart out of their bodies, and will give them an heart of flesh. In Ezekiel chapter 36, God renews his promise. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your body, and I will give you an heart of flesh. And the book of Jeremiah specifically refers to the significance of Moses breaking the tablets when God says, I will make a new covenant with, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, the which my covenant they break. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts. For Christians, this became one of the most important passages in the Bible. St. Paul simply repeats this passage in Hebrews. So he's writing to the Hebrews. He's just quoting straightforwardly Jeremiah, but he does use one interesting new word. I will perfect unto the house of Israel and unto the house of Judah a New Testament. So it's actually the phrase a New Testament, but he's just translating there. His version of it, this is obviously the English translation, but he is making it's a different use of the word from the notion of the covenant. So it's a change from covenant to testament, a New Testament. Not according to the testament which I made to their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my testament, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the testament which I will make to the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will give my laws into their mind, and in their heart will I write them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The opposition between the stony heart and the fleshy tables of the heart was central to Christian exegesis of the Bible. And of course, but it had developed nonetheless in the Jewish scriptures with its own emphasis on the contrite and broken heart, from which the iniquity of hard-heartedness had been erased. For the broken heart was the only fitting writing surface on which God could inscribe his commandments. And there's a great book about this called the Book of the Heart, which really goes through this whole tradition. So the broken heart was the only fitting writing surface on which God could inscribe his commandments. In other words, to depict the Ten Commandments as wax tablets was to associate them with the new dispensation that Christians claimed as their own. The New Testament required not stone, but wax, not a hard, but an inscribable heart. Note, however, that St. Paul is not making an anti-Judaic opposition, as some later commentators would do, between stony-hearted Jews and tender-hearted Christians. Paul specifically follows Jeremiah in proclaiming that the New Testament is revealed, quote, unto the house of Israel and unto the house of Judah. He's writing to the Hebrews, so that's why I think he emphasizes that. Augustine would develop this idea to suggest that Moses himself was a figure not just for the old law, that is, for the 613 commandments that God gave to Moses, which included the ceremonial law, but also for Christ himself. It was indeed Christians who gave a central role to the Ten Commandments, going so far as to visualize Christ as the person of the Trinity who actually gave the Decalogue to Moses in the form of wax tablets. At the top of a page in the Decalogue Psalter, Christ. Sorry, I've lost my place here. Yeah, at the top of a page in the Decalogue Psalter, Christ presents a table of the Ten Commandments, Hang on a sec. There we go. There. And that is the Ten Commandments, by the way. So it's written down the page in the table. So that's the Ten Commandments. At the very top, left and right, is God and Moses. And I have to move this bit of my bar because it's crucial. What it says there is Jesus, J-I-H-E-S-U-S. So Jesus is specifically God as the second person of the Trinity, what's sometimes called Christ Logos, the preceding, the God of the Trinity from the beginning of all time, as Christians claim. And he's giving this diptych on wax tablets, which have been dyed red and green. Breaking the first set of tablets thus came to mean rejecting the need for the ceremonial laws for the 613 commandments, but precisely so as to instantiate the necessity for the 10 commandments. Nowhere is this stress on Christ as the giver of the Decalogue to Moses stronger than in La Somme Roi, which is only a late name for a book that was previously called a book that begins with the 10 commandments, or alternatively, of the 10 commandments of the law. So it's a late name given. So this is a book about the 10 commandments. It starts with the 10 commandments. It's got other things in there. It's got the virtues and the vices and so on, but it's specifically about the 10 commandments. The advisor who wrote the notes for the illustrators to follow specifically describes the God who gives the tablets to Moses as Notre Seigneur. So I go all the way back. I don't know if I can do that. I'm not doing well yet. I think I'm going to leave this. I don't think I'll go back. If I do that, it'll probably be catastrophic. Everything will actually. I'll try and get this out of the way if I can a little bit. Anyway, I'm sorry about this. There we go. Yeah, I won't bother going back. It was up on the anyway. So it does say in the instructions to illustrators that God should be specifically Notre Seigneur, a manner of address that in the form of Notre Seigneur commonly referred to the second person of the Trinity, namely Christ. And it is a young or middle-aged God with a cruciform halo who appears in the early manuscripts, like this one. So you can see here, I want to emphasize but this guy up here, particularly this one here, is the youngest of all. But they all have cruciform halos, even though it's an important point. This is not actually a distinguishing feature of Christ, rather puzzlingly. People think it is, but it's not. As I argued in my last presentation of material texts, there was usually no way to distinguish God the Father from God the Son before the 14th century. Both were normally depicted as young. In fact, they're depicted as brothers, identical twins. Both were represented with cruciform halos, and attributes like books and globes were used interchangeably for the two of them. One can see anyway how varied the illuminators were in their depiction of God, from the very young beardless Christ, bottom right, of the 1325 to 1350 St. John's College, Cambridge manuscript, and the yellow-haired gods of the top left and the middle one. The middle one's hard to see, but he is actually yellow-haired. All the way to gods who look somewhat older. Diverse as these gods are, none has any resemblance to the quite different gods of the 15th century illuminators of La Somme Roi. This God is certainly not Christ. He is God the Father. Yet again, artists have had to make choices. And the choice here the text does not force upon the reader. So the reader can just think God, but they have to choose how you're going to depict God. So again, there's no way to avoid this problem. And having no access to the advisor's instructions to depict Notre Seigneur, they chose to follow the new and, for an earlier Christian theology, untenable view that one should depict an old as old God the Father, and as an old God the Father as the God of the Old Testament. So what I argued in the last talk is that this is a completely untenable view, is that God is meant to be ageless. It's very specific to actually depict God the Father and God the Son as identical twins, precisely to make that point. And that was the conventional way of depicting God the Father and God the Son, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions. But leaving aside the problem of what God to represent, it is striking that in the first miniature of the two earliest manuscripts, and in them only, God appears to Moses twice. So the top left, we're looking at it. So the top left. So there are two images. God receives the tablets, horned Moses, and Moses gets the horned tablets, and on the right he breaks them. So he's throwing them down, but God is above him again. You can see God above him. And below is the golden calf. This is the golden calf and the Israelites. So this is a detail which I'll be looking at. The first time, as in all the later versions of the miniature, God gives the table to Moses, the tables to Moses. He appears, however, a second time as Moses destroys the tablets. Perhaps again, his eye appears. In the 1294, probably the earliest of all of these illuminated manuscripts, the manuscript is Baen, so it says on the, I'm not going to go through this. So God in the form of Christ Logos reaches down from heaven, a speech scroll stretched out in his hands. What is he saying to Moses? Is he warning him against destroying the tablets that he has written with his own finger? Is he encouraging him to break the tablets on account of the Israelites' idolatry, which is depicted below? We cannot know, because someone has deliberately erased what God is saying. It's actually been physically scraped off with a knife. Fortunately, the 1295 British Library manuscript preserves what has been censored in the earlier manuscript. And here we can read God's words. And the words are, brise ces tables, break the tablets. So God actually says, but this is not in the Bible. It says nothing. So Moses is thus responding to the direct commandment of God, but there is no such scene in the Bible. There Moses descends the mountain, but it is he and he alone who breaks the tablets. On this occasion, God is absent and silent. Was this why whoever erased the words in this manuscript decided that they had to go? Not only do the wax tablets contradict the biblical text, which seems to have worried nobody, but also God is now given a new commandment that is not a new commandment that's not in the Bible at all, which clearly did worry someone. This is a magnification of the image. The effect of the duplication of Christ's Logos with Moses on Mount Sinai is to strengthen Moses as a figure who belongs to the Old and New Testaments alike. In fact, Christ and Moses could be used interchangeably for the historiated initials of the first chapter of La Somme Roi, which I said is actually called. So this is actually the beginning. I need to move again. I'm sorry, there's the script. But what you can actually see in French at the top of the page is these are the 10 commandments of Notre Seigneur. And Notre Seigneur, so you actually see, ce sont these commandements. It comes on the second line, Notre Seigneur. And that just is previous for the first chapter. And then Christ is presented, and here it is Christ. Christ is presented as the second Moses. One second. It's the place there. So yeah. Yeah, in fact, let's say Christ and Moses could be used interchangeably. So these are two different manuscripts, one with Moses, one with Christ. You can actually just switch them around from one to the other. Christ and Moses could be used interchangeably with the historiated initials of the first chapter. But that, of course, also emphasizes Christ's relationship to the Old Testament. Christ gives the Decalogue to Moses in his role as God the Son. But in a 15th century manuscript of La Somme Loire, the incarnated Jesus preaches the Ten Commandments to his disciples. If I can move it, I don't know why it's not doing it. There we go. I'll try. I won't keep moving this around, but I will move this one more time. Yeah, okay. So this is a manuscript from Mouge. So this is the same manuscript. Again, I'm looking at the same text again and again of the Ten Commandments, but with different ways of imagining them. And here it's crucially, this is not God the Son as the third member of the Trinity. This is the incarnated Jesus at a particular moment in time talking to his disciples. Nowhere, in my view, has there been more confusion than in modern accounts of Christian attitudes to the Mosaic law. Christ foregrounds the Mosaic law, if by that one means the Ten Commandments. Indeed, he was frequently described as the second Moses throughout the Middle Ages. That Christ upholds law is a point that is clearly made in the Facundus Codex, which is from about 1047. There, no. What I'm doing here, I'm doing something wrong. There we go. I need to get rid of that. Okay. So here you can see the Christian cross is combined with four words: pax, lux, rex, lex, peace, light, king, law. And as Herb Kessler kindly pointed out to me, at the beginning of Leviticus in the Lambeth Bible, it is Christ Logos who hands a scroll of the Decalogue to Moses. And there you can see them magnified. You can see it very clearly, Christ Logos, top right, giving a scroll. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it was Christians and not Jews who emphasized the Decalogue. As Sarit Shalev Aini notes, quote, after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, some communities preserved the custom of reciting aloud the Ten Commandments in their synagogues. But gradually the sages came to forbid it, quote, lest the minim, a term that usually refers to Christians, lest the minim say the rest of the Torah is not true, and that these 10 and no more were spoken to Moses at Sinai. And this is a really important emphasis in Judaism, is that the words of Exodus are spoken. There's only some that are written, there are 10 that are written, but everyone has equal. There are 613 things that God says to Moses. Okay. So that's the danger. What Christians are saying, that these 10 and no more were spoken to Moses at Sinai. Maimonides explicitly denies any specific significance to the Ten Commandments. And this is what Maimonides says. There is no difference between such verses as, quote, his wife's name was Metabel, daughter of Matred, on the one hand, and on the other, I, the Lord, am your God. For all are divine words. All the law of the Lord, which is perfect, is holy, pure, and true. For Maimonides, it was Christians who had detached the Ten Commandments from all the other laws so as to pursue their supersessionist universalizing agenda. I want to conclude, however, with the convergence of Jews and Christians around the Ten Commandments in the 17th century. For it was then that synagogues, following the example of many Protestant churches, began displaying the Ten Commandments. In 1657, after the return of the Jews under Oliver Cromwell, a Sephardic synagogue was established at Christchurch Lane in London. In 1674, a major work was at first commissioned, a major work of enlargement was undertaken. And in 1675, the synagogue commissioned a large and striking painting of the Ten Commandments, supported on either side by Moses and Aaron. Edward Croft Murray, with British understatement, comments that it, quote, is difficult to say what was the original purpose of this picture, as certainly it would have been an unusual feature in the decoration of a synagogue. In my understanding, however, it was a stunning innovation for a synagogue. There was, of course, nothing surprising about the fact that the two tablets of the Ten Commandments were now made out of stone. The stone tablets were firmly established in Christian iconography by the 15th century. So you can see two images. One on the left is wax tablets, and the same La Somme Noire, 1464, it's clearly stone tablets. They're still a diptych, but they're stone. And here again, clearly stone. Okay. By the end of the 16th century, Moses and the stone tablets was a commonplace of Christian Bibles. First, in Catholic Bibles, beginning with ones printed in Venice on the left. It's hard to see here. At the very extreme left, this is Aaron, this side here, and this is Moses, this side here with the Ten Commandments. It's easy to see here. This is Moses, this is Aaron. This is actually characteristic of these Bibles. It's, they're Christian Bibles, but the central figures are Moses and Aaron. These are absolutely the central. It becomes commonplace. I've not found any images before 1578, the one on the left. And then they start appearing on a multitude of Protestant religious books, including the King James Bible, which is on the table if anyone wants to look at that. Again, it's Moses on the left, Aaron on the right. And then the Polyglot Bible, Brian Walton's Polyglot Bible on the right. But none of these even begin to suggest the sheer size of the stone tablets in the painting at Pre-Church Lane Synagogue. Nor do I know of a painting of this date where so much care has been taken with the lettering. The painting is usually attributed to Aaron de Chavez. And when I say usually attributed, there's virtually nothing written about this. And it goes back to the 1930s. The painting is usually attributed to Aaron de Chavez, the first known Jewish painter to work in London after the return of the Jews. De Chavez was Dutch, but at some point after 1660, he and his wife moved to England. And when he died in 1705, he was interred in the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish burial ground at Mile End Road. In fact, as we learn from the account books of the Pre-Church Lane Synagogue, the painting was a collaboration between de Chavez and one Avila. How much care has been taken over the lettering, and the reasons to see this as a collaborative effort is shown by the money paid to the two. Note that Avila was in total paid more for the lettering than de Chavez was paid for the rest of the painting, for which de Chavez presumably had to provide his own materials, excluding the canvas. The canvas itself was bought by the synagogue for £1.17 while de Chavez was paid £5 for the painting. Avila, on the other hand, was paid £3 for his supervision of the painting of the letters, and an additional £2.10 for the gold in which the lettering was to be done, amounting to £5.10 in all. I am presuming that de Chavez did the actual painting of the letters based upon Avila's preparatory sketches and advice. But the fact that it was Avila who bought the gold paint suggests that he carefully supervised the completed work. I am also guessing that the person referred to in the accounts as S.R.H. Avila So I thought of S.R.H. Avila first, it was possibly Sir Henry Avila. So I didn't get anywhere with Sir Henry Avila. But I think who he is actually Isaac Israel Avila, who was appointed as rabbi in the synagogue in 1675. In other records, Avila is called Hakam, literally a wise man, but a rabbi in Sephardic usage. So I take the payments as being made to Senor Hakam Avila, and I've come across this form of address quite commonly of Senor Hakam elsewhere. This Anglo-Dutch Spanish painting had, I believe, an important role in the increasingly close identification of the Ten Commandments with Judaism. In 1679, 4 years after the painting was completed, two publishers in Amsterdam undertook the printing of the Tanakh in Yiddish, but both chose for their title page the figure of Moses, although in one he was accompanied by Aaron and in the other by David. You can see particularly the left hand, how close that is to the King James Bible. I mean, you've actually got this long Protestant tradition. You have 100 years of Bibles, Christian Bibles, with these two figures. Both depict at the top of the page Mount Sinai, where Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments from God. But when I saw David Ruderman yesterday, he showed me his copy of the second edition of a small pamphlet that had a very large and significant afterlife. Abraham Yargel's Jewish Catechism, first published in 1595. Oh, wait a sec, I could have to go past that. There we go, I have to go back. Okay. But when I saw David Ruderman, said this is his, on the left-hand side is his copy of Abraham Yargel's Jewish Catechism, first published in Venice in 1595. In many ways, Yargel attempted to bring Judaism and Christianity closer to each other, modeling his primer on the Catholic Catechism of Peter Canisius. There was, however, one sticking point. In every Christian catechism that I know, the Ten Commandments are central. Yet, as David pointed out to me, Yargel's primer does not use the word 10 a single time, although it does sometimes adopt the Christian tradition of referring to God's commandments as opposed to the notion of sayings, the speech of God. Where in a Christian catechism one would expect to find an exposition of the Ten Commandments, one finds instead a dialogue between master and pupil on Maimonides' 13 articles of faith. So I think it's really crucial. 13 articles of faith. They have no resemblance to the notion of 10 commandments. And they're not commandments either, although the word commandment is used. There are no 10 commandments in Yargel's book because they were the very hallmark of the Minim and of Christianity. In early Jewish tradition, the 10 commandments had held a unique status. Although officially they had no greater significance than the other 613 mitzvot, they were daily recited aloud in the temple. But after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and with the appropriation by Christians of the 10 commandments from the other 613 mitzvot of the law, they, together with Moses, tended to be downplayed by Jews. In my view, through the High Middle Ages, the 10 commandments became a dominant symbol of Christianity. While synagoga, and as a negative antitype, she was a negative antitype, not because she held the 10 commandments, but to the contrary, because she dropped them. After the 17th century, however, the 10 commandments became commonplace in Jewish books and in synagogues, and synagogues throughout Europe and America began to display the Decalogue prominently. It was now Judaism that was increasingly symbolized by Moses's 2 tables of stone. And when David Ruderman's father was working as a rabbi in the military in the Second World War, he was issued with a prayer shawl. Embroidered on it are the Star of David and the 10 Commandments. Thank you.
you so much, Peter. And the floor, both real and virtual. Questions, comments?
Yes, just lots of little observations. First of all, very near the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam is a church of Moses and Aaron, which, as far as I know, you don't find elsewhere, and that's late 17th century.
Okay.
And certainly corresponds with your frontispiece
Yeah.
title pages.
Yeah.
I also noticed that there was a heart, not on the King James Bible, but
No,
on the Antwerp.
yeah,
the Antwerp Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm
granted.
thinking also about your comments about the writing on the heart or softening the heart, stone, and wondering again. I assume that's the Stephen Yeager book, the Book of the Heart that you were referring to. But the other thing that happens in the 16th century, and it may be completely unrelated or much more of a matter of convenience or mathematics, is that maps begin to take on cordiform shapes. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be?
I don't, not about the second thing. I'm sorry, I'm just suddenly blanking now. So the first point is about, what was the?
Well, I was talking about the Moses and Aaron, and then the fact that the Antwerp Bible has a heart.
Yes, the heart, that is actually a really crucial thing, that nearly all the later Geneva Bibles, which were incredibly widespread, they were far and away the most popular, they were quarto Bibles, mainly quarto Bibles, and they circulated very widely. They were printed in Amsterdam with fake title pages. They all show a heart. The later ones all show a heart in the title page. So I think it's absolutely this notion of inscribing upon the heart. And I think that is a deep Christian tradition. But of course it's there, as I say, I mean, it's absolutely from Judaism. So there's this constitutive misrecognition that you've actually taken over Ezekiel, you've taken over, this is the language, St. Paul makes it very clear that, this is where it comes from. And so even that language of the New Testament. So a later tradition, particularly it's been picked up, I think, rather falsely by scholars, is that there's an opposition between grace and law. The opposition isn't between grace and law, it's opposition against the 613. It's about the ceremonial law. And so it's absolutely crucial to preserve the Ten Commandments. That's central for why Christ so often is shown, depicted, giving the Ten Commandments, God in the form of Christ Logos. You want to call on people? I've got. You call on people. People like okay. Black.
Great talk. Did you consider that the original tablet might have been waxed on stone instead of waxed on wood?
Oh, that's really interesting. You mean when you actually try to imagine a scene that actually.
Well, maybe originally, like 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Yeah. Maybe they were laying away at stone, maybe really thin stone tablets.
Yeah.
They laid the.
I love that. I tell you. I mean, these are the kind of material questions I love to think about. Which is I actually don't know about the technology. I mean, one question I have thought about is the question of whether they could be slate, and that's why I actually wanted to show all the images of the coloring of it. So that's why the coloring is so important. But also archaeologically speaking, as far as I know, no wax diptych. I mean, I've never seen medieval diptychs made with slate. I have seen 19th century ones, so I've actually seen diptychs that could be used by schoolboys. So they do exist, but I've never seen early ones. But I think that's a really interesting question, and I actually don't know when wax started being used. I mean, obviously clay is the main thing that people are using, and one of the things that's so great about clay tablets in the Middle East is you could keep them in water, and that's what schoolboys or trainee scribes did, and so it's an erasable surface, and it only becomes hardened when you put it in the sun or bake it, and that's what they've done here at Penn. All of our wax tablets were baked, but that turns it into a hardback, so to speak. But before that, if you keep it moist.
It's fascinating. Thank you. No, there's so much there to think about and to explore. What for me was particularly fascinating is the sort of influence from one religion to another. And I thought of, there are two things I want to mention. One is the juxtaposition of Moses and Aaron figures. When do they appear for some reason? Because Moses is the antitype of Christ, and Aaron is the antitype of St. Peter.
Yeah.
As the first priest.
Yeah.
So that, I'm thinking of Sixtine Chapel and the two frescoes with Botticelli, the punishment of the sons of, I don't remember, which basically, in the Old Testament cycle, which basically gives Aaron the authority of the priest, which at least makes St. Peter.
Yeah.
And then in the fresco across the church, we have the donation of the keys and the torture of the temple, which makes St. Peter the Pope.
Yeah.
And those two things are very critical. The other thing is the Protestants.
Yeah.
I told you today I was thinking of the cycles, narrative cycles, but there's no Christian narrative cycles of the Ten Commandments. They're Protestant.
Yeah.
I think it's correct. And also I think they use more actually the tablets and the big tablets. They start appearing in the 16th century. And that sort of coincides with also with the Seminary synagogue.
Yeah.
So so the only seems to be an incredible.
Thank you. Well, it's certainly true. I mean, the Protestant churches start putting the Ten Commandments in the East End. And so they often actually even take away altars. So for a Calvinist, strongly disapproved, the early Calvinists particularly, they strongly disapproved of altars. And, in the middle of the 17th century, they go around Cambridge and Oxford, taking out all the stone altars. Some of them were preserved and brought back again. They got rid of the notion of height. And so you had to have a movable table, a wooden table. And so the idea was it's idolatrous, and then they often put literally wooden tablets, in the East End of the church. And that happened in synagogues too. So synagogues, but later, a little bit later, it starts in synagogue. But the notion going back to Moses and Aaron, the one image, it's not significant enough to go back to the image, but the earliest image has Moses on the left and Aaron on the right. And that's very unusual, is that for Protestants particularly, the relationship between them is crucial. Is Moses is the senior figure, Aaron is the junior figure. And for Protestants who hated the Pope was Antichrist, the radical Protestants, the Pope's Antichrist. And so to the extent that Aaron is seen as a figure of the ceremonial church, so the radicals by the late 16th century are always insisting Moses is above Aaron. Moses is above Aaron. And it goes straight forward into politics when they actually want to abolish the bishops. They want to get rid of bishops. And so when you want to get rid of bishops, you say they are the legacy of Aaron. And you have to say, you have to obey Moses. So they appeal to Moses. Moses
on the left, he's heraldically superior as well.
Right.
And there was only one unusual exception where Aaron was on the viewer left, Moses on the right. But almost all the other ones.
The viewers perspective, that's right. He's always on the viewer's left, which is on God's right. Yeah, so God's right. So
Thank you so much, Peter. This is wonderful. As always, you have a way of kind of noticing, picking up on these things that are so basic that, they seem to have kind of fallen between the cracks, which is fascinating. I was wondering about, these artists, 14th century illuminators, 15th century illuminators, and their choice of depicting wax tablets. I mean, I wonder if it's a sort of maybe a fairly kind of anodyne sort of linguistic thing. I mean, in the vernacular, French tablette, or something like tavola in Italian. I mean, by that period really means a sort of panel. And in fact, I'm sort of channeling Sarah, who's teaching tonight, she's not here, but who's written a lot about the tabletier, the métier in medieval Paris, and they were the makers of ivory and wood writing tablets, wax tablets, right? The tabletier. So I wonder if, just an artist thinking of, this term, I mean, as opposed to a kind of tablet of stone, you need to, there's no single word for that in the Romance language. You'd have to say like tablet de pierre, like as you showed, specifying material. But if you just said tablet,
Right.
tabula, etc.
Right.
You know, maybe the sort of vernacular understanding of that is just a kind of a panel or literally a tablet for you know.
I totally agree with that. That's really helpful, Nick. But the problem is that the Bible, the second commandments, for the second time, is so specific. It doesn't just say he writes on stone. It says that Moses is commanded to actually make 2 stone tables. So the word, and I did say that, the word's very, very, you know, and I didn't even go, I mean, even in classical antiquity, it could be, the word could be used to talk about an image, you know, a painted image. So it has an incredibly wide range of meanings. It doesn't really define anything very much. So that's true. But why I particularly wanted, I could have talked about the Bible Historiale, but why I wanted to really talk about La Somme Loire is because we have the instructions of an advisor. So you don't just have the Bible, you have someone who says, you're going to depict these things. And they did depict the horned Moses, all of them depict the horned Moses. So in a more complicated versions, I would talk about what you do pick up.
Right.
That was striking. So they did pick up the textual element. They did follow Jerome because he says, you know, cornuta. So you've actually got that word. So you've gone some elements through, but then there are other elements that no one's going to say what no one would have ever written, which God you're going to depict. They just say, but he does say Notre Seigneur. And that's interesting. Notre Seigneur is then as now. You don't say that about God the Father. Notre Seigneur is Christ. And so to that extent, there are these little clues. But normally speaking, people wouldn't have said that even. An instructor would say, depict God.
Right, right.
And you do whatever the familiar way was of depicting God. But of course, then the problem arises that God keeps changing from a Christian point of view. It turns out to be rather important, whether you think it's God the Father, God the Son, and particularly from a Christian-Jewish relations, because of course, from Christian-Jewish points of view, Christ isn't God at all. So that's not God, but God the Father. So God the Father is more acceptable in that sense, because even though it's not acceptable to depict God, of course, but nonetheless, you know, there is a sort of way you can take that on board.
David Stern.
David. Hi,
Hi,
David.
Peter.
I forgot to say,
wonderful
I'm writing this for a fish script for David. That's what, and I should have said right at the beginning. I forgot to do all this stuff about who I, you know, why I was doing this. But anyway, thank you, David. So you're
So thank you, Peter. It's like listening to your obituary before. No, thank you. It's a wonderful talk. I just had a few notes. First, as I think you know, the wax tablets also appear in Hebrew manuscripts.
Yeah.
They're not simply in Christian manuscripts. They also appear in
Yeah.
Hebrew manuscripts.
Yeah,
So it's not a uniquely Christian phenomenon, although they appear actually in myriad forms. They also appear as scrolls. And I mean, in the Talmud, in fact, there's a passage which describes them as stone scrolls, which was, they're scrolls made out of stone, which was in fact how miraculous they were. So, so the tablets seem to be rather polymorphous,
absolutely.
more polymorphous than one would expect. The other place where they appear, well, I think also that they first appear in synagogues actually in Italy in the 16th century. And it's part of sort of the change in Italian synagogue architecture, which reflects, you know, Italian church architecture. But I think that that's actually been documented or written about at least. So it's part of a larger sort of, you know, complex of things. But it's worth pointing out that the scroll is actually used in England in the beginning of the 13th century as a badge that Jews have to wear after the what's his name, William of, that famous accusation, the ritual murder accusation, the Jews are accused of ritually murdering him. Jews are,
the scroll was always perceived as a good thing by Christians. So the scroll.
No, but the Jews are forced to wear scrolls on their clothing as a
Right, the scroll as opposed to the Ten Commandments.
No, not a scroll. The tablets. I'm sorry. This tablet.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay,
Are the tablets are. Jews are forced to wear.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Two rectangular tablets, not round topped.
Okay,
but rectangular tablets on their clothes as a badge.
Yeah.
It's a kind of yellow star. It's a 13th century yellow star. It's one of the earliest
very generously, David,
of a badge.
The Hebrew manuscripts with the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I didn't get into that was part of the very big debate about who the artists are, about whether they're Jews or Christians. And there's a huge debate about that kind of question. But secondly, and the
Right, but
last thing I wanted to say-
Jews would have overseen the manuscripts.
Right.
And,
Right.
they wouldn't have
But
allowed the artists
I
to take.
still would want to have that, from what I've heard anyway, and from the stuff that I picked up when we worked together at the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, was that there's actually quite a lot of distancing going on by Jews moving away from Moses. Moses gets downplayed and Abraham gets upplayed. And it's precisely in relationship to Moses and the Ten Commandments, because they've been taken over by Christians. So the Moses and Christian, so I see this, certainly the manuscripts I'm looking at, really does seem to be almost a badge of Christianity. And it's a badge of Christianity against the notion of the ceremonial law.
Well, I think the Ten
absolutely
Commandments more than Moses.
Yeah.
I would think the Ten Commandments more than Moses.
Okay.
You're absolutely right about the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
And in Maimonides' Creed of 13, his Creed of 13, taking over from the Ten Commandments is actually quite revealing.
Right. But thank you for everything. I forgot to actually have all these things at the beginning, but I was actually going to say, first of all, right at the very beginning, that this was written for you, and this is actually comes out of what the work we did back at the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies.
No, that's unnecessary. No, thank you very much, Peter. It's a wonderful.
A thought about the persistent Christianity of the Ten Commandments is, of course, the debate over putting the Ten Commandments in courthouses, right? Where it's not an issue of the separation of synagogue and state, but of church and state.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Eileen.
So we have a bunch of questions coming in from the chat, starting with one from Zach.
Right.
One digression from the text of Exodus is wax versus stone, but this goes hand in hand with the shift from Moses preparing the second set of stone tablets and God again inscribing them with his finger to Moses writing them.
Right.
So is perhaps the key shift to Moses writing or taking dictation, and the artist imagined that via wax tablets, since it's absurd to imagine him chiseling stone. At least at the beginning of Exodus 34, God says that God will write on the stone tablets the same words as before. By the end of Exodus 34, Moses is writing them. It's weird.
Yeah. I'm going to stand up here because it's going to be easier to see people and it'll be easier to talk directly to people on the screen. So first of all, where are you, Zach? Are you there? I know you're where you are. Anyway, thanks. That's a really excellent question. There is a debate about, it's not very clear the account in Exodus and the account in Deuteronomy don't thoroughly go together. In other words, it's not really clear with the second commandments who writes them. Sometimes it seems to be Moses, sometimes it actually might be God himself. Of course, from a Jewish perspective, as you know, the crucial question isn't about writing at all. It's that the words are spoken by God. That's the crucial thing. And the writing is a secondary question. And the writing then is what the Christians have actually sort of overemphasized from a Jewish perspective, and including the word commandments, which isn't a word that's used by Jews to talk about it. So the laws are, and I've lost. I'm sorry, the movement back here. Can you repeat, Zach? Can you actually want to speak about the sort of central point of it that you were trying to make? Zach, you there? Good. Can you repeat this? Okay, you can do it.
Moses is writing.
There.
Go ahead, Ion.
Yeah.
Well, if you shift to understanding Moses as the one who's writing it, which it seems like all of the Christian artists are.
Yeah. I mean,
Something other than stone, because how's he chiseling these things out of stone? So either you have him writing on stone with acrylic ink, or so I guess I'm wondering whether you think the impetus is in the wax tablets with the idea of inspiration, for instance, or if the impetus is that Moses is the one writing, and then you think about, well, how would he be writing?
yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, I'd have to say that the one complication here is there aren't very many images. I've probably shown the only images I know of Moses writing. Nearly always he's receiving from God, whether it's the first commandments or the second commandments. So it's very, very unusual. So I've overemphasized that. I mean, in the sense that there are these images, but they're not very, very, very common. I do think it's very striking that. I think it's certainly true that for any artist imagining Moses writing, it's kind of crazy. You can see that from the Paduan picture Bible. It's sort of crazy to imagine Moses with a chisel, sort of letter by letter. So it becomes comic. And so the notion, and I do think in that sense, you've got a very interesting, because God can write on stone because it's with his finger. So that's the crucial thing. His finger is the writing implement, very explicitly, for the first set of tablets. So he writes with his finger. So he doesn't have any difficulty. But from a human perspective, it's a completely different case. And so I do think that's a really excellent point, that the moment you start wondering who's doing the writing and whether it's Moses doing the writing, then you can't really imagine a table of stone. You can't imagine it with his, and as I say, it looks slightly comic in the Paduan picture book, because there he is. And when he actually shows writing, he's writing with pen and ink, which makes no sense. He can't write on stone with pen and ink, so it was a shortcut mistake.
No, but you can paint on stone, and you have to before you carve it. You have to paint on it first.
Yeah, but it doesn't have paper. It doesn't depict any paper there on top of the stone. Yeah.
There are a couple more chat questions that no one wants. So I can just give them both to you.
Yep.
The first question is, are there many paintings where the tablets are represented as closed notebooks? And the second question is, could you give us some examples of wax tablets used for sketching pictures?
Okay, two different answers. The first answer, yes, there are plenty of images of the closed tablets, often shown pretty carefully with straps around them. So it's a diptych. I could, so anyone who wants to see, I could actually put up more of these images, but probably it's not a good time to do this. So it actually shows straps around them that they're openable. It's quite common when God gives the tablets to Moses that they're closed, but also in depictions when he breaks the tablets, it's very, very common to show them closed first, and then he throws them down and they open and smash, and so you see the inside. So you see the outside, then you see the inside. So that is an answer to the first question. And the second question was about sketches. And I'll be honest about it, I haven't done much looking I don't know exactly how much survives even. I mean, there are plenty of wax tablets without their wax. So this is the irony. The irony is there are lots and lots of archaeological finds, above all ones that Sarah's writing about at the moment, which are ivory. So the ivory are the best preserved because they're so beautiful and they're so luxurious. They're expensive items, they're luxury items. And so, the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, has a large collection of wax tablets. They were wax tablets once upon a time. but the wax is long gone. So, you know, that's the problem. Once you get erasable paper, which is the medium I'm much more familiar with, which is really the end of the 15th century, which is displacing wax tablets, there are lots of artist sketchbooks. And so, you know, goes through to Rembrandt, it goes through to, so we have sketches by Rembrandt on this erasable paper with the stylus, you know, so it's the same technology or the same idea of an erasable, but it's just a different thing. So there, and they're used for music as well. And so you can see things. So it's just it's in my view, they're primarily mercantile, is that the primary use of these things is to be in markets. And they survived into the 19th century. I've seen 19th century wax tablets that were still being used, but almost entirely for market activity. And that takes you all the way back to the woman at Pompeii, you know, that she's, I presume, is, you know, I don't think she's about to write down visions. I think she's about to make you know, something much more practical, like a shopping list or, you know, something. I'm not trying to say, you know, I mean, a class is obviously, she has to be fairly high class, but I don't think, I think it's a very standard opposition. On the one hand, the wax tablet is associated with the writer's hand. So it did matter in classical antiquity if you got a letter from Cicero that wasn't wax tablets. That was good. Because it means it's autograph, you know, you're imagining it anyway as autograph writing, as opposed to a slave, you know, it would often be a slave who actually transcribed it onto the papyrus.
The Pompeian tablets, interesting, are a codex. She has many tablets, so it's maybe not a shopping list.
No, actually, you're
a longer
but, I mean,
text.
you still might have the codex, the codex, and use it for a shopping list.
Yeah,
You can use it for lots of different things.
Sure. But it does imply a longer text on
Yeah.
them.
You're quite right.
A question that's probably unanswerable. I mean, you showed diptychs that are black wax, and you showed diptychs that are red, and diptychs that are green, and you had one that was half red and half green. Do you have any idea what's going on there?
Not at all. I have no one else that. I mean, all I used it was slightly. I mean, it does look like. I mean, there is an argument about the two different tables. The first, well, the strong Christian argument is that the first three commandments really contain it all. So the first three of the 10 commandments. But there's another longer argument, which is the first 5 commandments, which are the more important ones, and in a way you need them. But the argument is that the second 5 commandments will follow from the first 5 commandments. Like, you know, honor your father and mother is taken to be all sorts of things. So the notion of I forget which number 1 is, love thy neighbor. But I don't remember. I just told you someone I can't remember the 10. I write about them. But I do think that you're meant to love your neighbor, and obviously not meant to murder them. So that it does say you shouldn't murder people. But if you're meant to love your neighbor, you probably shouldn't murder them. So I think, you know, that's one of the arguments. So it could be that there's a notion of the two.
Is that the only representation of a wax diptych that you have seen that's in 2 different colors?
There's 2. I found 2 or 3.
But always of the 10 Commandments, not other representations.
Yeah, only the 10 Commandments. I've never seen anything else. No.
Interesting. John Pollock.
Thank you, Peter. It's amazing as always. And this it's getting late, so this is a big question, but let me try this. One of the, I think, bigger amazing arguments you're trying to make, and then looking back to your work on the expulsion, which you nicely wove in here, is that I think you're starting to take it to a place where you have a group of essentially anonymous artists making theological choices, not just artistic choices. I mean, interpretive choices that are on the edge of theological decision. And I mean, maybe I'm pushing it too far, but it's sort of in there. And I was just wondering, I mean, you had the one example where, you know, the clear extra text, Dieu brise les tables, God breaks the tables, has been censored. Yeah. Can you come up with any other cases where you might see, or maybe Nick knows some of this, where an artist has gone too far in an illuminate, in a choice, and we can see some sort of control being exerted later, and that would sort of.
I mean, the three-headed trinity that you talked about, I think there are a few examples where that, you know, this is.
Absolutely.
So what you can start to see the pushback
Yeah.
of, you know, against the illuminator's freedom of or decision.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly with representations of God, I mean, that you see a lot of pushback, particularly after you know, the Counter-Reformation. So from the Counter-Reformation onward, you see an increasingly strong attempts to control, but they often don't succeed. Like, you're not meant to produce triple-faced gods, but in Latin America, they did it all the time. You know, they go into the 20th century, so you know you can see a continuous tradition. So it tries to capture the Trinity as a single face with faces, you know. But the objective to that was monstrous. You know, it looks like a monster, and so it looks like all the things that in the tradition of the ballads, this is meant to be evil things that you know are born this way. So there were all sorts of pushbacks. But I do think that artists are actually inventing. Whether it's specifically in the first instance for theological, and that's a really interesting question, because Chris McFarlane is writing this wonderful book, has just about finished this wonderful book, which is about 17th century, what you might call popular Hebraism. I mean, going way down the social scale, that people who are learning, you know, shopkeepers, they're learning Hebrew. They really, they want to engage, and this is the sort of this great moment of revolution, or people actually are engaging with theological questions. And I think that we've underestimated that. You know, I think we've tended to think about an elite culture. Obviously, the cheese and the worm would be an example of just that kind of thing, Carlo Ginzburg's. But we haven't looked at a lot of examples, but Kristen has actually done a much bigger picture that she'll be showing in England of these people who actually are very. So I do think it's very possible that artists are sometimes making explicit theological arguments. The problem about this is when we find instructions to artists, like one of the paintings I know best is this Enguerrand painting in the south of France, where the contract specifies, it's a theological contract, it specifies that father and son must look identical. That actually specifies that they must be identical, and so that's a pushback in the what's the date of it? Do you remember the date, Nick? 1440s, I think. Yeah. So it's clearly a pushback. By the 1440s, you've really got the father is pretty much dominant, and you know the difference of age is pretty dominant by then. So this is a contract specifying. So there we know where it came from. It comes from theologians. This is a theological contract. You know, it's actually saying we need this, and it's got pretty much the whole of what. I mean, it's not related as far as I know to Dante directly, but it's pretty much the whole of Dante. You might say it's got limbo, it's got heaven, it's got hell. You know, it's an incredible summa. It's really a summa. But there, it is a contract.
On the subject of artists making choices that veer toward theological interpretations.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the talk that you had a bit of a digression about the tradition of the horned Moses.
Yeah.
I was just hoping we could get into the digression a little bit and hear
Yes.
about how these traditions are interacting.
Yes. Why not? Okay. Maybe. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't have asked a nicer question. You know. You know, everybody will. Okay. Is there a way to get back into my?
Yeah, sure.
Laptop? Can you show me how to get back to my laptop? So we can actually see one of the things I love about this is because this is actually someone, they're clearly thinking very specifically about what kind of forms they are, and it's extraordinary. And here I do think they're actually following. In the first instance, they're following the advice. It says that the horns are on his face. The face is horned, and that's what they show. They show the horns actually not coming out like something. They literally look like outgrowths. Well, we'll see. Thank you. The point anyway is it says in the thing, la face connue. And face did mean, you know, it did mean face, as it does in English. And so when you actually look at these images, they're absolutely extraordinary in the sense, thank you. So that's fabulous. So okay, was it there? Now look at these horns there particularly. Do you see them? Do you see it's extraordinary? It actually grows out of the face. It doesn't grow and it changes. This is what's so interesting. Here you're actually getting sort of interpretations in the sense, and here these are even more extraordinary. And it's even turning in, looks like it's turning into horn at the end. It's like, you know, it's like, it looks like fleshy outgrowths turning into at the very end. And then, well, yes, you do. Sorry, that's the closed tablet, absolutely. So that's the closed tablets at the same time. So you can really see. So I did put together all the horns, and this is my favorite. So these ones here, like a party trick, you know, it's literally like, but they've completely changed. In other words, that what you've got is these early ones. Now, these are all, this one is certainly painted without the instructions. So the instructions are there for the, so it's not no longer la face. And so these horns will go back, they go backwards onto the head, they become part of the head. This looks like animal horns, very conventional. This is just an amazing party trick, you know, my favorite horns. And then there are golden horns, you know, so you've got, so there's obviously huge flexibility. It's one of the things I don't like about the word illustration, is that even when you say horn, where do you go with that? I mean, and look how variedly they've gone. And so each one has implications. And so that once you start looking at that, you know, you can perfectly imagine someone making a theological interpretation out of this, whatever it would be, you know, perhaps it's Moses as clown, you know, the second role is clown, but it's certainly bizarre. So I think that, you know, I think that really is an important, here just, you know, those are the, so these are the ones I say, la face connue, and the face, it's no longer the face, whereas the early ones are the face. You can see also, by the way, the stone tablets, you've gone from the wax tablets, the wax triptych to the stone.
But I mean, what's fascinating is that you then have the illustrator who in some ways is really following the instructions and otherwise not. So it's done selectively within the same illustration. Right?
Exactly, that's exactly right. Yeah. So it's not, you know, that's why I sort of, I do want to say that illustrations don't illustrate, but it doesn't mean they don't relate to text. But what's complicated, there are some things that you can't illustrate. And of course, that's one of the biggest arguments of all, which is, can you or should you illustrate God? And so that's, you know, that's a massive problem and a central problem between different religions, you know.
And in the case of the Padua illustrations, it's in a way the illustrator is saying, well, this actually makes no sense, right? Because the first one is stone, and he says, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. So the second one is the wax of paper. Yeah. So it's trying to reconcile the text with common sense, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm afraid that it's 7 o'clock. I'm delighted that it's 7 o'clock, but
It says it's 8 o'clock.
Huh? 8 o'clock, right? We really have been going on. Peter, we cannot begin to thank you enough for yet another extraordinary session of the workshop at Material Text. So you can come back anytime.